In this video, we'll examine the inflationary bias and political pressure the legislative branch imposes on the Federal Reserve. Specifically, we'll analyze Senator Elizabeth Warren's letter to Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, where she advocates for a federal funds rate cut to address the disproportionate impact of rising housing prices on marginalized communities. By presenting macroeconomic counterarguments to Senator Warren's letter, our goal is not only to illustrate the complexities of the rise in housing prices and the high federal funds rate, but also to clarify the types of economic programs and levers the Fed can utilize, what falls beyond the Fed's scope, and which areas of the economy fall within the legislative branch's jurisdiction. By analyzing Warren's letter, we hope to highlight the political benefits for self-interested politicians that such letters bring, and argue that this added political pressure negatively affects Fed policy, advocating for further independence of the Fed from the legislative branch. On January 28, 2023, Senator Elizabeth Warren and 3 other Democratic senators penned a letter to Jerome Powell urging him to cut interest rates in order to combat the housing affordability crisis. We write regarding the current state of the housing market and ongoing concerns that high interest rates have aggravated the country's persistent crisis of housing access and affordability. In advocating for a cut in the federal funds rate, the senators cite the rise in mortgage rates. Mortgage rates have risen to 20-year highs in the past year, a direct result of the Federal Reserve's campaign of aggressive hikes to the federal funds rate. Concerns about housing supply. High interest rates have also worsened our nation's housing supply crisis. As mortgage rates have gone up, the price of home listings has not significantly dampened. Rather, a decade-long dearth of supply has kept costs high on homes across the country. A rise in rental rates. The effects of the Fed's monetary policy also extend to the rental market. As high costs and interest rates deter prospective first-time home buyers, many families and individuals choose to stay in the rental market. And the disproportionate effect the housing affordability crisis has on minority groups. The ever-growing affordability crisis places a disparate burden on the shoulders of Black and Hispanic households, who own homes at rates 28.6 percentage points and 25.8 percentage points below white households, respectively.
There are quite a few macroeconomic misconceptions present in Senator Warren's proposal, Jerome Powell. Perhaps the most obvious flaw in the proposal is a lack of acknowledgement in the trade-off between low interest rates and high inflation. Specifically, the federal funds rate rose following the pandemic as a means to counter high inflation, which was induced by generous fiscal policy. Thus, a cut in the federal funds rate would only create more upward inflationary pressure on the economy, as articulated by Jerome Powell.
We know that reducing policy restraint too soon or too much could result in a reversal of the progress we've seen on inflation and ultimately require even tighter policy to get inflation back to 2%.
An uptick in inflation would exacerbate rent, food, and gasoline prices, disproportionately affecting minority groups and low-income households who lack options in substituting goods in times of high inflation. Thus, Warren's argument fails to acknowledge the major offsetting effects of higher inflation on the economy that contradict the positive effects that cutting the interest rate could have on increasing housing supply and decreasing housing prices. Additionally, Warren's assumption that lowering the interest rates would decrease housing prices is not founded, as housing affordability began to plummet when the real interest rates were at the zero lower bound, according to the Dallas Fed. Thus, a decrease in the interest rate may not necessarily mean a decrease in the housing prices, making the problem of housing prices an issue of reduced housing supply rather than a high interest rate. This macroeconomic misconception on the role that the interest rate affects housing affordability also reveals another significant flaw in her letter, as she fails to distinguish between actions and levers that are beyond the Fed's mandate. The Fed's role within the housing market is best stated by Jerome Powell.
So when we think about, our statutory goals are maximum employment and price stability, and that's what we're targeting. We're not targeting housing price inflation, the cost of housing, or any of those things. Those are very important things for people's lives, but they're not, those are not the things we're targeting. We're also well aware that when we cut rates at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, the housing industry was helped more than any other industry. And when we raise rates, the housing industry can be hurt because it's a very interest-sensitive sector. On top of that, we have longer run problems with the availability of housing. We have a built up set of cities and people are moving further and further out. So there hasn't been enough housing built. And these are not things that we have any tools to address.
Thus, the current high interest rate can be understood as a response to combat high inflation, which is one of the primary functions of the Fed. Thus, the housing supply shortage is not within the scope of the Fed's mandate, but rather within the scope of the legislative duties, specifically between the cooperation of state and local governments to accommodate less restrictive zoning practices and a carrot and stick approach that incentivizes local governments that meet housing production goals and punishes those that lag behind. Thus, it is to tie the mandate of housing supply to the Fed, as this letter does, and adds more extensive political pressure on the Fed while sheltering the responsibilities that state and local governments have on the housing supply.
It is fairly evident that Warren's letter was a political stunt with the only purpose of signaling to the public the politicians and Democratic Party's goodwill in hopes of boosting their re-election campaigns. Political stunts such as these ignore the consequences of additional political pressure on the Federal Reserve, and which in some situation affects the decisions of the Fed. Case in point, a paper authored by Thomas Driscoll estimated the effects of political pressure on the Fed with a hyper-focus on the Nixon administration. Novelly, he used the number of interactions between the president and the Fed chairman as part of his identification strategy. The results of his empirical study suggest that political pressure on the Fed indeed does have an upward inflationary bias on consumers' inflation expectations. Ultimately, history also corroborates this empirical evidence, as during Burns' tenure, inflation ran rampant at an annualized rate of 6.5% as he endured political pressure from the Nixon administration. Ultimately, Powell must not succumb to the pressure being exerted on him by both political parties, but rather look out for the long-term success of the economy. Moving forward, to ensure Fed independency and remove short-term pressure from politicians, we propose to increase the Fed chairman and vice chairman's term to 14 years to mirror the Board of Governors. This extended term limit will reduce pressure to act in the short term to please the current president and/or legislative body due to there being no fear of being reappointed. With this new term limit, the chairman's focus can be shifted to ensure the long-term health of the economy over their 14-year tenure and beyond.